Hi everyone, Alan Schimmel here, Techstrong TV. Welcome back to our Black Hat coverage. You know, we're picking it up from this morning's sessions. We're really happy to be joined by, 17 years at Sonatype. He's a fixture in the security community. Big, he wears his heart on his sleeve in terms of open source and open source security. He's been a big contributor to so many different open source foundations, projects, and movements. Our friend Brian Fox, CTO, co-founder at Sonatype. Brian, welcome. It's good to see you here at Black Hat.
Thank you.
Yes. So how many years of Black Hat is this for you?
Honestly, this is my second.
Really? You used to not go to Black Hat?
I don't know why. I think it was always just not a good time in the summertime, kids and everything.
First week it's not a better time now at 112 degrees.
Yeah, it's 116 when I landed yesterday.
Yeah, no, it's cooled down today.
Cold front.
It's crazy, but no, Mitch and I were talking. I think our first Black Hat was 2004. We were still Secure then, right?
Yeah.
We co-founded Still Secure. It was over at Caesars. It was very different than it is now.
Yeah.
But of course, it's grown. It's another show where by the security industry for the security industry, and it's a great time to meet up with friends and colleagues and really get a chance to talk security. But you know what, Brian? It occurs to me before we jump into Black Hat and what you've been seeing here, there might be folks out here who are not familiar with Sonatype. As I mentioned, you're a co-founder, CTO. You're at Sonatype 17 years. This isn't a Johnny-come-lately company. But for those who may not be familiar with Sonatype, let's just take a minute and give them a little background.
Sure. So Sonatype, we started, some of the other founders and we were main contributors on the Apache Maven project back in the day. Apache Maven is a build system for Java, not exclusively Java, but it started in Java. It's an Apache Software Foundation project, and we kind of built from there. We built products and solutions around the ecosystem. So our first product was the Nexus Repository Manager, which was really the first commercial repository manager all the way back in 2009. There's an open source version that still exists. And from there, we also run the Maven Central Repository, which is really, that's the repository where all open source Java components are. There is not another one. No. So anybody doing Java is getting open source components. You can't really write Java without open source, which means they're downloading it from us.
In spite of what Oracle says?
in spite of that, yes. Oracle publishes open source projects in Central as well. Yeah. And so running that repository for the last, effectively longer than the company's been around, provides really interesting insight into the ecosystem and what people are doing, what they're downloading, good and bad behaviors. And so probably around 2010, we recognized there was a pretty big gap in the behavior versus what you would expect. So what do I mean by that? Some of the most popular versions of important libraries, like crypto libraries, happen to be the ones with level 10 known vulnerabilities that have been around for a couple of years, and yet people were still using them. So that led us down the path of trying to understand what's going on here, why does this problem exist, and how can we help solve that? And that led to a portfolio of products that the world would now refer to as software composition analysis, more recently SBOM capabilities. But we've been doing these things now for that was 14 years ago. When most people didn't understand the importance of open source in their portfolio. They had no controls for it. Sadly, the majority of the industry still sits in that position. And I know you've heard me say this before, but we've all heard of Log4j, Log4Shell. Mm-hmm. Where in December it'll be 3 years
for Log4Shell.
Yeah. Log4Shell, 3 years post one of the most significant vulnerabilities that was impacting our industry. And I looked last week, 30% of the downloads of Log4j are still of those known vulnerable versions. Really? 3 years ago.
Wow. I'll go one better. Struts, another one that Sonatype was way ahead on. Right?
Yeah. There were multiple, not even the struts that caught Equifax.
Right.
There were some that preceded that by 3 or 4 years at least. Yeah, and so it's shocking to see that consuming organizations are still by and large doing a really terrible job at managing their dependencies.
So this brings up something Mitchell and I discussed it at our last interview. You know, when we started Still Secure in 2001, we came out with intrusion prevention because we thought, who would not want to just stop traffic that's bad instead of just detecting and alerting? Well, we were wrong. Back then, people were not into blocking traffic automatically because they were afraid they were going to block the CEO's porn or whatever, right?
Right.
Or email, but yes.
Right. Or email.
The same thing.
Right, whatever. But the security industry's come a long way since then, right? We are into sort of automatically taking
We are.
action.
I would say that's the
updating.
bleeding edge still.
It still is.
Yes,
Still
it is.
early, but we're getting there.
We'll talk
for
to
sure.
CrowdStrike about it. But anyway,
Yeah.
But that being said, maybe what this said, what you just, you know, the idea that was still downloading, I think with Struts too, like 70%, 4, 5, 6 months later, we're still downloading the vulnerable version of it. Maybe what it says is they need Big Brother to do it for them.
Or warning labels slapped on it.
You know,
kind of
I
like
could-
your password manager says, this password's been compromised.
Yeah.
Well, no,
yeah.
or
Well,
this component is out of date. Like when I go to Amazon now and I look at a thing, it says there's a newer version of this product. Wouldn't it be great if we had that even?
I'm sure you've thought about it.
we have, and you know, those are the types of products that we've been building for a long time. And you know,
Yet to come.
right, right, and you know, it's a little bit of a challenge because certainly the ecosystem pulling from Maven Central, it's not just Maven, it's Gradle, it's Ivy, it's
Sure
Scala
is.
Build Tool, it's all of the bespoke integrations that everybody has, you know, it's the de facto place, like I said, for open source Java. So anybody that wants to download that, whether they're using curl or wget or whatever, they're just doing it. And that's where a lot of the consumption is going. And so it's not just a case of like, oh, just add a feature to Maven. Because Maven itself is built into many different tools like Jenkins and IDEs. All of those have an upgrade cycle. We've been down this path before, trying to reduce friction. It takes 5+ years before, you know, bleeding edge features that we put into the core actually are deployed enough to really
At
make
a critical
difference.
mass.
Yeah, exactly. And
to
so,
reach it.
so that's not a reason not to do it, but that's sort of just the reality check on where we are. And I think the other problem is many of the organizations that are still really exhibiting bad behaviors, they're also not upgrading their tools. So the people that most need the help aren't going to get it by a new feature, right? And therein lies the problem. And you know, people ask me a lot of times, why don't you just take all these versions off of Maven Central? And that's a really complicated thing. One of the benefits and the reasons why it is so embedded and popular is because it is intended to be immutable, and it's an archive of all the things, right? We can't just decide to disappear components because they affect some people. And you know, the analogy I like to use is, you know, peanuts. Peanuts can kill some people,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Lethal if you're allergic to them. I can go in the supermarket and I can buy peanut butter. I can buy anything that has peanuts in it. It's labeled clearly, hopefully. And so most vulnerabilities look a bit more like, you know, peanuts and somebody with a peanut allergy. It affects some people, maybe significantly, but not everybody. Now, malicious components, that's different. That's more like a poisoned, you know, component. Of course, if there was a malicious component, that's coming down. And so the Log4j one is an interesting case that I use. I think it's a useful bellwether because it was so easy to exploit. It was so widely deployed. And frankly, it got so much attention that everybody was asking their vendors if they were affected, what they were going to do about it. So even if you were on the edge case where it didn't really apply to you, it was just easier to fix.
It's like saying I don't do business in Europe. GDPR doesn't apply to me.
That's right. It's like, okay, but it's easier just to comply and move on with life.
Absolutely.
And so I feel like, unlike most vulnerabilities where you wouldn't expect the community to get to 100% upgrade because they don't all apply equally, Log4Shell was closer to that. It's still not 100%, but man, it's got to be better than 60%.
Right, it is critical mass.
That's right.
Let me ask
To me,
you-
it's that 70%.
I'm
Yeah.
curious, you mentioning how many things are out there using old versions of software coming off of Maven. Do you think automation, things that are automated that people don't have to touch and upgrade is part of the contributing factor to that? Or is it just pure
I think it cuts
security
both ways.
hygiene? I'm just wondering how much does
Well, I think it's
automation make
sort
it
of
better or worse?
So it's interesting, and I feel like I wrote on this, or maybe we talked about it at one point. But you know, the there's sort of two different approaches if you look at the different ecosystems. Maven, when we designed it, we preferred stability over auto upgrades for the dependencies, right? And so that means Maven's not going to fetch the latest version just because it's in the repo. That's actually an anti-pattern in Maven land. The unintended consequence of that is people who aren't paying attention to their builds, it's going to stay where it was, right? Which 15, 20 years ago, that kind of made sense. You preferred stability over instability. But now in a world where auto updates happen, that's a little bit of a challenge. But take the inverse. Many of the other ecosystems, NPM, Python, NuGet, things like that, they prefer the latest unless you tell it not to. So their behavior is 180 degrees the opposite. Well, what's happening over there? Massive amounts of intentional malicious components being injected. Why? Because they have a ready audience. As soon as it hits the repository, you've got millions of downloads. Right? And so the attackers are exploiting that. So we're not seeing that on Maven because you'd have to fake the name, which is much harder in Maven because of the way we manage the name spacing. But also, even if you did, nobody's going to download it right away. You have to then trick them into thinking this is a new version.
We used to see this like
in
Docker. Was it Docker Hub or Docker Swarm? It was the Docker repo. They did have that where they had people putting up bad container images that had a similar name and it fooled people into downloading it.
That's right.
But when it's automated, that doesn't work. But Brian, you made an interesting point here, and it's very nuanced.
Yeah.
I got that bad New York accent, but it's very nuanced, and that is the distinction and between vulnerability and maliciousness, right? One is sort of a precursor. Almost before you have malicious activity, there has to be almost a vulnerability you're exploiting. But just because you have a vulnerability doesn't mean necessarily there's malicious
it's like
activity
the difference
around
between
it.
something could be exploited versus it's got a keystroke logger built into the base image.
I mean, I think so.
Right.
I
That's
did
a good example what you're talking about.
We talked to very smart people in industry and companies, and they struggle with this. That they want to think about malicious components like it's a vulnerability, and it's very different. And so I actually recently did a little bit of a series on LinkedIn where I was throwing up some images and trying to find a good analogy. The one that seemed to resonate the most is this. So a vulnerable component might be some food that's been out at a buffet for a while and not kept at temperature. Say egg salad's been sitting around. It might make you sick. It
Makes
might
me
not.
sick. I've been there.
Right. It's going to make some people sick. It might not make all the people
I've got a
sick.
cast iron, so I'm good.
Right. But you kind of get your head around that, like, okay, it wasn't intended. It wasn't, when it was made, it wasn't a problem. But something went wrong, and it could affect people with weaker immune systems. It's a vulnerability. The malicious version of that is a food that's been intentionally poisoned.
Tainted, yeah.
Right? And so, like, the problem is the way you need to think about this and manage and defend your infrastructure between those two different things is very different.
Absolutely.
If you found out that your egg salad was poisoned, you don't fix that by putting it in the fridge. Or another, sort of analogy, you might eat around moldy bread, or cut around the moldy cheese.
Come on, who hasn't done that out there?
What college student?
Right. College.
But you wouldn't do that if the bread was poisoned, right? And so, like, many organizations right now are trying to deal with malicious components like it's moldy bread and they're just going to eat around it. And they're thinking, well, it's okay as long as we do scans at some point before we ship our software, we'll catch it. Well, here's the problem. Most of these intentionally malicious open source malware components are they execute as soon as the developer downloads it, because ecosystems like the ones I mentioned before, NPM, Python, Ruby, most of those execute something when they're downloaded. And so that install script is the thing that's delivering the payload. So it's often a smash and grab style. It's hitting the developers, it's stealing credentials, it's dropping backdoors, it's doing whatever. That attack happened as soon as your developer downloaded the thing. If you then run in your CI build, after they're done coding, they might not even see the malicious component because it might not have compiled. The developer might have realized, oh, I grabbed the wrong one, and I fix it, not realizing they've been backdoored, and then they check it in, and the rest of the infrastructure never detects that component was there. Or even if it did, it's too late. The attack already happened. Yeah. And so this is why I've been trying to really drive attention to this, is that you might have a decent system for dealing with vulnerabilities. I mean, like the Log4j thing we talked about, many organizations actually don't, but let's assume you do. That defense does nothing to help you deal with the intentionally malicious components. You need to be able to detect and block this up front before your developers get it on their machine. And that's why this distinction is so important for people to understand, because they actually have this gaping hole in their defense and they think they're covered.
And part of it is, I don't know whether it's human nature or not. You would think people in the security business, having been exposed to this, are a little wiser. But it's hard to wrap your head around someone saying, being intentionally malicious, right? Now, but we live in this is why we can't have nice things, right?
That's
we
right.
live in a world where there are intentionally malicious actors.
That's right.
Whether it be nation state or financial gain or hacktivists or whatever, they do intentionally malicious things. And if you're almost 25, 28 years in security, between us, we've been in security most of a century, right?
Right.
If you are not thinking about what an intentional attack, malicious attack is going to do, how it's going to do, where your vectors are, what your attack surface is, don't call yourself a security person.
Right.
This is the world we live in, unfortunately. And if that's, look, Mitchell and I sold the product in 2005, VAM, that's still secure, Vulnerability Assessment and Management. And I used to call it, not only when we'd go out and do customer reviews, the security people would call it job security. Because, it just generated a list of vulnerabilities. Yeah. And have at it. And, back then, if you scanned once a quarter, you were way ahead of the gang,
Sure.
right?
Right.
And that was after stuff was deployed, not before deployment.
I think it's the attacks are evolutionary, though. It's sort of like life finds a way. Well, the attackers do too. They recognize that there was a wide open underbelly here, and now they're leveraging it against us. And that's the problem.
About that. Has it evolved to, it seems to me, that kind of approach where the developer downloads it and something executes is not only a good way for an attacker to get malicious or something into the code that goes into your code, it's also a great way for a supply chain. I may not need to touch your code after I've gotten that malicious component. I get into the CI/CD build process, or I go do other things in the.
I'm part of a component that got put into the whole thing, right? This is the whole idea.
This is just a sleeper cell.
They're all over the place. We see some that are clearly designed to get into the product and then get shipped to downstream. Like SolarWinds is sort of an example.
Yeah.
It's not exactly the same, but the intent was the same. That the goal is to get after your company's customers, But the real risk is most of these are after your company's developers and your developer infrastructure. Right. And in a modern world where everything is in the cloud, somewhere in that system has the keys to one of those online databases.
Probably in
right,
the
those
code.
Secrets in the code, in the code or in the environment, and that's the risk. And so we've seen these are old examples at this point, years ago now. We've seen examples where people got into. There was one, it was a camera company that had surveillance for Tesla factories, hospitals, police interview departments, the closed circuit. They got in through the development infrastructure and then moved laterally because they picked up something from a developer machine that then got them into the database, and then they went from there. And this is the point. If your defense is only set at focusing on securing the product you ship out the door, you're missing the new war, which is after
the whole left part of it.
The whole left part of it. And that's why I want people to understand that they're really not defended against this.
So I did a little bit of work, and I'm not blaming any company. Any company can get hacked, so I'm not bad-mouthing.
Every company gets hacked.
Every company. It's just a question of F. But you look at like the Okta breaches, and there have been several.
Yeah.
Jump Cloud, another company similar to Okta, also had a breach.
Was it Snowflake?
Snowflake recently, but even after all that. They got into that build, but not to go after Snowflake, not to go after Okta. Okta works close with Microsoft. They got them into the Microsoft piece of it. At Jump Cloud, they were really just targeting out of 100,000 Jump Cloud customers. There were 6 customers that they were targeting, large companies over in Asia.
They're just a delivery system to get to those.
And
right.
they just used, as a transit point to get into those customers. And I mean, that's almost the very definition of malicious. I'm reminded, 15 years ago, a guy named Giddy Cohen, I don't know if you know Giddy, he started Skybox Security, if you're familiar with Skybox. I had the same discussion with him then because his Skybox back 15, 18 years ago, they would draw like an attack map showing you, here's your vulnerability, here's how a malicious actor can exploit it, how they're going to reach it and exploit it. And that's when the light bulb went off for me on this.
Yeah, right.
That is the difference between just a pure vulnerability versus an exploitable, a malicious actor and all this. But again, that was 15 years ago. You got to smarten up, man.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about this recently. I wrote an article called "The Ostrich Effect and Survivor Bias," trying to look at because I think it's humans are wired to try to procrastinate. It's like genetic benefits that are conveyed, and so it pervades our thinking. And so I looked at different examples, and I wrote about this recently because of this problem where I talked to very smart people and they're in denial that there's an issue here. And we even we analyze repositories, and we've gone to organizations and we look at their repository and we're like, not only is this a theoretical problem, you have 15 malicious components in your repository right now, which means those attacks already were delivered somewhere in your organization. Those things didn't get there by themselves. A developer, at least one, downloaded that or it wouldn't be in your proxy.
Yep.
And people look at that and they go, and it's sort of like, the vulnerability
It's
is
the cause and effect.
That's
because
right.
it's not close enough to the.
Well,
to the
that's
gem.
the survivorship bias where they're like,
Right.
well, it might have happened, but I guess we
No,
survived.
there's a meteor coming my way. Call me when
Right.
it's about an hour out.
Well, it's more like you found bullet holes in your walls, and like, well, nobody died, so
Thank
it's okay.
God, right.
I
Thank
shouldn't
God I didn't get shot.
Well, I shouldn't be comfortable with people shooting at my house just because nobody's been hit yet.
Yeah, but
and
they'll get a different zebra tomorrow.
That's right.
And that's always been the problem,
That's
right?
right.
We're all zebras in a herd, and today's not my day. It's a good day. I don't got to outrun the lion. I just got to outrun the zebra next to me.
That's right. That's
And
right.
and that's
Yeah.
But that's human nature. You're right.
It is.
It's
That's
crazy.
what's happening. So I think we'll get there eventually. But man, it's
hard. Sometimes
we saw the same trend educating the market around the SCA and the reason that you needed to manage this. I mean, like I said, we've been
And
doing
that
this
was a
for
long time coming.
decades. It was.
We were all about DAS and SAS and ISAS
and not
this
paying
and that.
attention to the dependencies.
And
until,
here's this
right.
Trojan horse that came in on 99% of the organizations that are using open source software, right?
Right.
And now now it's accepted. It took 10, 15 years.
It took, and like everything else, it took some high-profile attacks. It took Struts a couple of times, Equifax, the man on the street understanding, some aspect. It took SolarWinds and Log4j was really the thing that finally, and everybody was freaking out, kind of saying, like, oh my gosh, all our critical infrastructure is dependent upon open source, and nobody pays these people, and I'm just sort of like, welcome to the party. Where have you guys been for the last 10 years? I'm glad you care now. So let's move on. But by the time
there was a lot of suffering.
There was a lot of suffering, but Log4Shell was 2021, I believe. The intentionally malicious components that I started seeing and tracking and talking about and writing in our State of the Software Supply Chain report started in 2017. So, it was
4 years.
It was 4 years. And so like everybody woke up to fight last decade's war 4 years after the new thing was already taking off. And we've seen it, we've reported it time and time again that since 2017, these things have taken off. It's doubled again in the last year. We're looking at over 350,000 intentionally malicious components that are out there. Those are a lot of minds to avoid.
That number goes up every year.
Every day.
Yeah.
Every day. You're right.
Every day.
So, and look, I hate to come up here and do the FUD thing, right? I'm not, and that's not, I know you're not doing that.
You're not doing
either.
it for that reason. Yeah.
No.
But the fact of the matter is you need to understand the difference between vulnerable and malicious. You need to acknowledge that I don't care who you are, because that's the other thing. People say, oh, I'm not a target. I'm not a target. What do they want from me? I just have...
No, I mean, these things look more like an automated phishing attack on your developers is what's really happening,
Right.
right? They're putting these things out there and hoping people download, and then they exploit from there, and...
They look for weakest links.
That's right. And we've seen some people that we work with that didn't have, our data and our tooling, so this was largely invisible to them. They rolled it out, and they found, even to my shock, dozens and dozens of malicious components already in the infrastructure, and some of those were deployed on tens of thousands of actual production systems.
Which is no walk in the park to fix.
No,
Right, and that's a pretty significant thing when all of a sudden you have visibility into this problem and realize it's been there all along, and you have no idea what it's been doing.
Talk about rolling
But to
out some
I was
patches.
going to say though, but to put ourselves in the shoes of our audience out here, who the hell wants? You mean I got to update 10,000 machines? But wait, you can't do it automated. You got a blue screen of death. You're going to have to
It's
roll it
worse
out manually.
in a malicious
Who wants to
environment.
hear that?
That's evidence that there was some kind of attack. You now have to understand, what did that component do?
You got work to do.
And did it
What are the
infiltrate that
consequences from it?
machine?
Yeah,
Right. It's
yeah.
not just like I have to update the software. You still have to do that because it's in your software, like a vulnerable component. Except now you don't know what damage it may have done,
And where else
you
it
have
went.
to declare an incident and try to go figure out if there's been more damage.
I like your food analogy. You were talking about egg salad before, but think about it as
Only
in terms
'cause
of
it's near lunchtime,
I know, I'm
Mitchell.
getting hungry. But there's no food here in Vegas.
Spoiled
No,
egg salad is
Yes.
a good way to skip
No,
lunch.
it's kind of like, okay, well, let's step back. It's really about the cleanliness of the kitchen. The software development process and the tool chains and all things, it sources into that are very much
Well,
like.
if you handle your food correctly, you don't
Well,
get
yeah,
spoiled egg
that's
salad.
why we wash our hands. That's why
Yeah.
we do food
Right,
inspections.
but
but
importantly-
it's that tainted somewhere in that process.
That's right,
of
but
being
those
created.
things won't stop you from somebody who's trying to poison.
True.
Right, washing your hands and keeping stuff cold, those are like basic
Those are
hygiene.
self-inflicted. kind of
Right, but
things.
if somebody's coming into your kitchen and poisoning your
or
ingredients.
delivered bad ingredients.
Right,
from
then
the
that's a
supplier,
very different
right?
problem.
Yeah.
That's right. And to take it to Deming, like we talked about Deming forever,
Sure.
right? Like you think about the auto manufacturer, it's like Deming principles largely are about producing better, safer cars.
Right.
The product that comes out the end of the factory. That's great. You need to do those things because
Mm-hmm.
there's lots of benefits. Also, it's not going to stop somebody trying to blow up your factory.
Right. It's not going to stop a malicious act.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
Or selling you defective tires that you put on the car and it causes
That's right.
untold havoc.
Intentionally defective
Filings
tires.
That-
in
and
your
again,
engines
that's another
or,
thing.
That's
Toyota.
right.
Guys, I want to pivot though, if it's okay, Brian. I'm going to ask you to put your Sonotype hat on now.
Okay.
And you can leave your security advocate hat on too. But from a Sonotype perspective, you guys got some interesting things going on with S-bombs.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite, kind of the granddaddy of DevOps virtual events, All Day DevOps, is October 10th this year.
Yep.
You got some stuff rolling out there as well. Tell us, share.
Yeah, so all day DevOps, that's as you know, the 24 hours of multiple channels.
Around
of-
the world,
Around the
following
world
the
of
sun.
live
Good deal.
streaming stuff. So I'll be leading a panel with some other industry experts talking about this year's State of the Software Supply Chain Report. This is the 10th year.
Absolutely.
So I'm personally writing the 10-year look back
really?
a chapter to kind of look at how all of these trends have changed. Not all of those trends have gotten better, as we've talked about, but I call it like I see it. And so we're going to be talking about those findings. I don't have all the findings yet, but you can imagine there's a lot of these trends we've been looking at that we didn't just wake up as an industry and get better overnight.
No. But that's part of this evolutionary thing you said.
It is, yeah.
Evolution's not linear.
No,
It's one step backwards, two step forward, one step sideways.
it's very slow and then all at once, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So yes, we'll be launching the report. We'll be talking about some of the key findings and what to make of that on All Day DevOps coming up.
So for people who want to register, it's alldaydevops.com.
Yeah.
I don't know. You can register right now. They probably
It's
have at
open.
least your session and other speakers up there. It's usually amazing. It's 24 hours, follow the sun, as we mentioned. And it's, look, I think I sponsored or was one of the co-sponsors of the first couple ones, media sponsors, because that was around when we started DevOps.com.
Yeah.
And so always happy to see that doing well and having a good all-day DevOps. And it's important. We're just going to be releasing finally the Got DevOps report,
Yeah, DevOps
which kind of
next,
looks
yeah.
at where DevOps has gone and where it's going. And all-day DevOps is kind of like that as
And if you
well.
register, you get access to all the recordings. You don't literally have to sit there
No.
for 24 hours and watch
Well, unless
5
that's
channels.
your thing.
Yeah, unless
Right,
that's
you
just
know?
you can, but you don't have to. You can watch them at your leisure.
Yeah, you could try to follow the sun.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we've got that. What about S-bombs?
Yeah, so I mean, we launched a product called S-Bomb Manager. We announced that when we were together in Paris.
Absolutely.
That was
right before the Olympics.
all the way back in March.
Yeah.
Forever ago now. And so that's the reception on that's been really good. I think organizations are, it's still early. People are still trying to figure out what to do with S-bombs, what they're expected to do with S-bombs. But regulation is coming. Next year, the PCI, I believe it's a 4.0 standard, has some requirements for that. So a lot of banks are sitting up and paying attention. Of course, the government has been, increasingly requiring that across the U.S. government. In Europe, you have the Cyber Resiliency Act, which is basically, not by the exact same terms, but effectively saying you need to have bill of materials. And there's still a lot of conversation. There's a lot of naysayers in the industry about, well, S-bombs aren't going to solve all the things, and they're right. But you can't start solving a problem without the transparency, without the visibility of what's actually in your software.
You know that one of the things, we've all been, as I said, we've all been in security a long time. Stop looking for magic bullets that solve everything. There is no such thing.
That's right.
Haven't found one yet.
But this is a solid, stop looking for it.
Right.
This is a solid, it's not even, you want to call it technology, fine, but it's a solid way of really getting a handle on things and helping. Does it solve every corner case? No. But
Sunlight,
it's better than what you got.
That's right. Sunlight is a good disinfectant. Being able to see what's inside the transitive hull of the products you're using.
Yep.
You may not like what you find. As a vendor, you may not like what your customers find. Well, what are you going to do about that? Hiding it is not the answer.
No.
That's where we are today.
And just sitting here and waiting for some perfect solution that's going to solve all of life's mysteries for you is ridiculous. I mean, it's just unrealistic.
Well, it also follows the general principle. Every security team starts out with, I have to know about things in order to be able to secure things. This is what gives that visibility.
That's right. And, some people argue like, hey, look, this dependency, take log4j, it's at the bottom of the stack. It's 10 levels deep. I didn't choose that version. That's okay. Now you know. In some cases, there are mitigating controls. Like in the log4shell, you could have blocked the JNDI LDAP URLs if you knew you needed to. Right? So while you may not necessarily be able to affect the upgrade of the dependency until your whole supply chain does it, doesn't mean you should sit there and be A, completely unaware, and B, completely defenseless. Most of the time, you can have some mitigating controls, and it starts by that visibility. So if nothing else, having that visibility is there. And you see vendors that are like, but I don't want all my customers calling me and asking me to upgrade. It's like, well, I mean...
But they're going to be getting this information sooner or later, right? Because this is going to be required, I think, in all contracts.
I mean, then get out of the kitchen.
That's kind of my point. Like, if
don't cook.
All of the excuses not to do it are not the kind of excuses you would typically tell your customers. I mean, I literally was in a session on that 2 years ago, where everybody was kind of in denial and really upset that they were being kind of forced to provide transparency. And I sat there and listened to all the arguments, and then I got up there and I was like, think about everything you just said. None of you would say that to your customers.
Absolutely
None of you
right.
would say, I don't actually know what's in my software because it's too expensive and it's too hard to do it. Like, really? You're going to say that? So take a step back from a society perspective and ask yourself, what's the right thing to do here?
Put yourself in your customer's shoes.
Exactly.
And if that's not a good place to be, then something's wrong.
That's right. That's right.
That's the bottom line.
And that's where a lot of the pushback on S-bombs is coming right now, because I think organizations aren't prepared, like we talked about, to actually show what's inside. And ultimately, it's going to be painful, but it's necessary.
Where do you think we need to, so to the naysayers, right, and you acknowledge that it's not the silver bullet, what do you think the next evolutionary step is for S-bombs? Where do we need to go next with it?
Well, I think obviously organizations need to have good ways to collect them from their suppliers, right? To transport that data, to be able to analyze the data, understand it. Of course, in the early days, S-bombs aren't going to be complete. They're not going to be accurate because not everybody has SCA tooling that can, precisely generate them. Unless, of course, you're Sonatype customer, then you do.
That
but
wasn't a setup question. But yes, no, you're right.
I made it one for you. You're welcome.
Okay, take the ball and run.
Right, but so organizations are going to be able to validate that the SBOMs are correct, that the data in there is useful, have an opinion about the stuff inside, and then be able to respond. I think that's going to be the next evolution. Once people grapple with, I don't like what this SBOM is telling me, then I think that will lead to better architectures. It will lead to better selection of components. That's the sunlight being a good disinfectant kind of thing. You know, if you have a terrible, unused, unmaintained dependency in your stack, and your customers start seeing that, what's going to happen? You're probably going to make a better choice, and that's going to lead to better security outcomes, better software outcomes in general. So I think that's where that goes. It's going to take some time, and it's going to be a little bit painful because we've all been kind of developing in the shadows for a long time.
Very long.
And coming out into the sun is going to be painful, but it'll be okay.
How do you see this working in a world of, not that everybody's doing it, but continuous deployment where software is updated, very frequently?
Yeah, well, that's where you need the tools.
You've got to have automation.
You've got to have
automate
You
your
can't
SBOM
stuff it into a database.
So-
and
Yeah,
report on it
exactly.
once a year.
Right. That's right.
I'm usually not a big fan of government intervention in security, for instance, or in technology in general, because whether it's the EU or the US, you get a lot of politicians who may not have much
Don't know what they're
technical
talking about.
background. Their intentions are good, but the road to hell is lined with them. But that being said, I think the way to shorten that time frame to get critical mass adoption and use of things like SBOM is to have government regulation mandating it and kind of forcing the issue.
Yeah.
You mentioned PCI. Well, PCI was great because everyone takes credit cards, so it became sort of a universal thing. But I do think we don't have 15 years to wait for SBOMs to become common. We don't even have 5 years to wait for SBOMs to become common.
Yeah.
And I don't see, I think that's the best catalyst to doing this, is having like CISA. And I will tell you, not getting into politics, but CISA over the last 3 to 5 years, so even predating the current administration, has been almost a breath of fresh air in saying, hey, let's work together, government and industry.
Yeah. In the last 2 years,
in the last 2 years, it's gotten a lot better.
They've gotten,
Yes, no doubt about it.
They've hired a lot of good people there. They're doing a lot of good work. They've engaging. I'm talking with them all the time, and that happened never. 5 years ago, there was nobody to talk to.
No.
Right?
Well, no. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. But this is a case, as I said from the outset, this is a case where I think it could really help us.
We lost a decade. I mean, you probably remember this, but it was in 2013 that the language that ultimately came out in the executive order that led to all the SBOM work came from a bill that was before Congress in 2013,
Yeah, absolutely.
and it didn't get anywhere. So we lost a decade.
So that
on
is
this.
the flip side, right? You look at all of CISA's, proclamations or whatever you want to call them. They don't come with congressional approval. And so they're very subject to administration, how they're going to be enforced or whatever. We still don't have the political will in this country.
But we're just one country in the world, and pretty much every software vendor is a global vendor. And like it or not, that's where some of the European regulations might be pushing the boundaries.
They've at least have exhibited the will to do something.
That's right. That's right.
And more power to them.
So it's going to be the least common denominator, most strict kind of regime that we're all going to have to follow. The harmonization of those regulations is going to become a key issue. And I know I was just speaking to Alan Friedman last night talking about some of this, and global harmonization is a thing that is on their radar and trying to figure that out. Because if we end up with incompatible global regulations from a software industry, how do you deal with that? You can't. And so whether our government gets together and moves it forward or another one is almost irrelevant. It's going to happen. It's happening. It's happened. Some of the legislation has passed.
So I forgot what the term is, but past, present, and future are all together.
That's right.
In the same
That's right.
continuum.
Singularity.
Yeah, singularity. Anyway, hey, before we drop off, Brian, quick plug here, a little Techstrong plug. We're working with you, and Ilka
Ilka.
from Sonotype. We're going to have a special Techstrong TV series that Brian's going to host. I'm tickled pink about this. This is going to be really cool. Looking forward to working with you on that. We'll also be doing a series of learning roundtables. So, Brian, we're going to see each other a
Exciting
lot.
times.
Yeah.
Well, probably in Salt Lake City, too, for CubeCon.
Yeah, I'll be there.
It's just a couple months out.
Maybe it won't be so hot there.
Wow, so
Salt Lake City, probably not in October. I don't think it's early enough to ski or anything. I don't know if
No.
there'll be snow,
Can't
but
be, but yeah.
Yeah.
um, we've got that. We've got All Day DevOps, again, October 10th, alldaydevops.com. That's about it, man. Thanks for popping up and
stuff.
taking time
Yeah.
out of your Black Hat crazy
Conversation.
days.
This is the kind of conversations we need to be.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's great. I love
Cool.
talking to you guys.
check it out. Brian Fox, CTO, co-founder at Sonotype, here on live at Techstrong TV from Black Hat. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with more coverage.
Nice stuff.